Hi, everyone. Welcome. Thanks for joining. Before we start, I'd like to encourage everyone in the audience to please submit questions using the Q&A feature at any time. We'll be spending a little bit after the panel to talk through some of those in more depth with our panelists. So everyone, welcome. Thank you all for being here. Can you please start by telling us briefly a little bit what you do and why you got into this work? So maybe we can start with Linda. You're muted. You might be muted. I don't know if I can hear you yet.
I was instructed to be muted. Here I am.
Follow the direction. Great.
Back again. Well, it's great to be here. So how I got into this work and what do I do? Yeah. Let's see, the quick answer about how I got into this work is I used to work for Outward Bound, believe it or not. So the experiential learning came from experiential learning. And then I ended up with a doctorate in education at Harvard. And at some point along the way, I also worked in advertising in New York, which really gave me an appreciation for clear communication. So those three woven together are the foundation for where I am now, which is my sweet spot is the science of learning, how we learn, and then complex systems. And I did a lot of study of that, both at Harvard, but also with coursework at MIT. And so what I do really essentially is I help people to understand, visualize, and work with complex systems. And in true systems fashion, that's not a straight line. Like those understanding, visualizing, working with all are a feedback loop. And the more we go around that circle, the more we build our own muscle for systems literacy, I think. So I work with Fortune 500 companies, I work with schools, I work with foundations, all around building understanding of systems, how they work, but also applying them, those concepts, often for systems change. It could be around climate change, it could be around childhood obesity, a lot of different systems issues.
That's great. Thank you. Mary.
Hi. Yeah, so I work for a program called Roots and Shoots, which is part of the Jane Goodall Institute. And the Roots and Shoots program was established by Dr. Jane Goodall in 1991 in response to a conversation she had with a group of students in Tanzania, actually, where she was living and has done much of her work on chimpanzees. And these students told her that they really felt a lot of despair about the problems in the world. And she established the program to help create some structure and support and encouragement for students to tackle the problems and not to just feel like there wasn't anything they could do. And now there are Roots and Shoots programs serving young people in over 100 countries. And I focus mostly on the US. And we offer lots of tools and supports and resources and even funding to support young people who want to take action in their own communities, and specifically around three programmatic areas. One is helping other people, the other is helping other animals, and the third is helping the environment. So it's really all around just supporting youth who taking action. I also have a long background in environmental education and citizen science. That's been my passion in my career, is connecting young people to the environment, to nature, and helping them take care of the planet. And I worked for over a decade at the National Geographic Society, and I worked at the National Audubon Society and World Wildlife Fund, all in the education programs. And the way I got into this work really is that when I was in college, I wanted to be a biologist and studying endangered species, and a lot like Jane Goodall, actually, trying to save the world through science. And I had this amazing opportunity right after college to work as an assistant on a project studying orangutans in Borneo. and helping a graduate student who was finishing her dissertation research there. She's now a professor for many years who's continued to do great work studying orangutans. But while I was there, I had this catalytic conversation with some of the Indonesian research assistants that we worked with. One of them asked me, why do you Americans keep coming here to study our orangutans? Why don't you study orangutans in America? And I realized at that time that there was a lot less access to information at that time. It was over 20 years ago, and the folks there in the inner part of Borneo didn't have access to the internet or even television, and they did not know that orangutans were endemic and endangered, and that we didn't have them in America. And I realized, just how crazy it was. I just started thinking about how crazy it was that we had this big study, but we weren't sharing the information with the study, even with the people who lived right in our study area. That's changed totally. That project now has this incredible environmental education program, but it really set me on a different path as well. That conversation set me on the path of really feeling like it was just important to focus on education and outreach and making sure science is accessible to everyone, that we really wouldn't save the world through science unless everybody got to be involved in science. So that's how I got to this career.
Amazing. Beautiful stories. Thank you both. Jillian.
Great. Thank you very much. And it is wonderful to be with all of you tonight, I would say, because I am based in Switzerland. I can say a little bit about my background. I've spent over 25 years, and I think I've stopped counting now, working within the sustainability community globally. So I've worked in over 62 countries now throughout my career with organizations in all sectors. And I myself have done a stint in the United Nations. I worked in the UN for a while, but I've worked for a number of different international NGOs that have global mandates with the International Academy of the Environment, with the International Union for Conservation of Nature. And now through my social enterprise, work with a lot of organizations actually from all sectors, including the private sector, in their work on sustainability, but my focus is on learning. So the work that I've done is really supporting organizations, teams, leaders in incorporating learning more purposefully into their practice. So these organizations contributing to sustainability are very passionate. They invest a lot of time, money, energy into the work that they're doing. And really my theory of change is that through more purposeful and intentional learning, they can really improve and strengthen the impact and effectiveness of their work. So it's really that's really my entry point. And I do that now as a social enterprise in a number of different ways, through supporting strategic planning, but also supporting just the learning element and strengthening their monitoring, evaluation, and learning and other informal learning processes. So that's just a little bit about what I do.
Amazing. Thank you. Now, Jillian and Linda, expanding on that a little, I understand you have a body of work that has come into the world recently. So why did you write the climate change playbook? What need were you seeking to address in writing it? And who do you hope uses it?
I could take a shot at that, Jillian. Is that just to start?
Absolutely.
Okay, so the why is, I think that climate science can be overwhelming. You can feel disempowered. What can one person do? And I think our book invites play into the equation, invites people to be students of their own behavior, which is the kind of the basis of experiential learning, meaning you play a game and you see yourself acting and you realize that's how you would act in a situation. And a lot of climate change requires behavior change. It involves fundamental understanding of climate science, but it also really involves individuals changing behavior multiplied, by lots of numbers. And so we did the climate change playbook as a way to reach different modalities of thinking, to use physical intelligence, and to get people involved. And it's a lot, I think it's a very non-threatening way, honestly, to understand some of the basics, but also to see what my individual behaviors are, and what my habits are sometimes, and how I can change some of those. And what does it take to work collectively with people to make change? A lot of the games range from very simple individual games to what we call mass games. So that can be done with a couple hundred people. So there's a whole range of activities.
I can add something to that. I think for me, because I work with a lot of NGOs, and my role was often as director of capacity building or head of learning, and even in 2016, when this book came out, there was a lot of fatigue around the climate discussion. And there still can be, but certainly the narrative could be very deficit frame. There was a lot of gloom and doom around that. And so it was really hard to rally and tap into people's passion, creativity, through more traditional methods of learning about climate change. And for me, games just provided that element of surprise. It encouraged people to engage. They're energizing. They can still address very complex topics, but almost in a little bit of a stealth way. So for me, that was part of my motivation for wanting to develop a games book to help support learning around climate change issues. I would say the other part was really about codifying practice. Trainers learn from each other. Like, we see a great game, we use it, we adapt it, but I think at some point it's really great to write it down. And so just that practice, and I really love that element of really trying to put down the rules, the instructions, the debriefing, briefing, so that it can be shared more widely. So that was part of my motivation as well.
That's amazing. Thank you. We're so happy that you did that. So Linda, focusing a little more, what is systems thinking, and why is it important to teaching about climate science?
Well, systems thinking is fundamentally looking at how parts interrelate, or parts, processes, agents to produce collective behavior. And if you think about climate, it is a set of interrelationships. You can't just say climate has to do with emissions. You can't just say it has to do with oceans and carbon sinks. It's all those different parts interrelating that produce global warming. It has to do with industry. It has to do with a lot of different factors. And so the reason why systems as a frame and climate fit together so well is climate is a system. And I think one of the biggest opportunities is to help people see their way into influencing that system. So if we collectively, focus on different policies around emissions, or even individual behaviors, what is the if you interconnect all those behaviors, what could be the impact? So it's both understanding how climate operates as a system, but also that we are, as Martin Luther King called, we live in what's he called it the interrelated structure of reality, that we live within systems. And so if we want to create change, we can leverage our networks, we can leverage how we are interconnected to make change. So it's a combination of both the science, but also leveraging the fact that we operate within systems. Nothing stands alone, right? It's that old phrase that you hear all the time: everything's connected to everything else. We might as well it's not independence, it's leveraging interdependence. How can we take advantage of that? And there's so many fun, even simple ways to help people to get reoriented. Particularly in the US, we have a little more emphasis on independence. I also write children's books, and I actually have a book coming out in a year that's about the difference between things being apart and together. So helping even little kids to see what's the magic of interdependence. So that's kind of a baby step towards the systems thinking.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, we are all connected.
We can take
Um,
advantage of it. I think that's the thing, you know.
Yeah.
If there's one thing that the pandemic showed us is that yes, that's true.
Yeah.
And the good news that's not a good news. I would just want to make sure I'm really clear. The pandemic is not good. The silver lining, or the one piece that came out of it, was a more felt sense of just how interconnected we are. We can shy away from that, or we can learn from it and work with it.
Now, I'm switching a little bit to Mary, the concept of citizen science, which seems to be a closely related topic. Can you explain what citizen science is?
Yeah, citizen science is the involvement of the public, which could be children or students, or it could be anyone, in the process of real scientific research. And I'll pause here also to say that citizen science is sometimes called by different names, like some organizations use the term community science, because the word citizen is fraught with some political weight in the US and maybe in other places as well. So yeah, you might see the same concept referred to as community science. It's a little complicated to figure out how best to refer to it, but it's basically public participation and real research. And that's a really key piece of it, is that it's real research that it maybe a scientist is looking at as part of a larger study, or maybe it doesn't necessarily have to be an academic scientist who's looking at it, but it could be someone who's helping to make public policy, like a zoning board deciding on which parts of an ecosystem they want to protect. So it's science being used for something beyond learning, but there's also learning inherent in it. And so the public can participate in any aspect of the scientific research. So it could be in collecting data. There are a lot of citizen science projects that involve collecting data, but there's also opportunities for people to help with analyzing data, even with coming up with the scientific questions and framing those questions, or interpreting and sharing the results.
Nice, great. And why do you think it's so powerful as a learning tool for students and communities?
Well, I've seen this in my own experience with citizen science as a learning tool. And there's research also bears this out on learning through citizen science, which is that being part of something that really matters is just a powerful motivator for students. And I had an experience with this long ago when I was working directly with kids outside doing field trips. And we collected water quality data on a local stream in New York State. And the kids would take measurements of pH and turbidity, and they'd look for macroinvertebrates in the stream and come up with a measure of the health of the stream. And that was interesting. But we were doing it, and I was collecting all these data on pieces of paper, and then didn't have anywhere to put the paper. And then I realized that our local extension office was trying to track the health of the streams. And they were actually really interested in these measurements that my students were taking regularly. So I started bringing these piles of paper over to the extension office. This was also a couple of decades ago, so everything is digitized now, but it was paper then. But they would excitedly accept these big piles of paper. And then I realized that once I started doing that, when I told my students that their research was actually being used, they just became much more engaged in the work. They just knowing that what they did mattered. It's just very powerful.
I think building on that a little, like as we kind of think about student learning, like what are some of the climate concepts that you all feel sort of students most struggle to grasp? Like, I don't know, Jillian, Linda, maybe if you want to talk about the games matrix a little bit, or yeah, I'm just curious kind of your thoughts on that.
Sure. I'm happy to talk about the games matrix. Maybe, I know you've got a slide for that. Maybe you could bring it up. This is an illustration. In the climate change playbook, we wanted to help educators using the games to actually select effective games. And so this matrix features in the first couple of pages, and it gives you a number of different pieces of information that can be helpful. One of them is the kind of game, and the other is about a misconception. So your question was really about, initially about kind of what people struggle around climate change, for example. in terms of learning. And for example, if you look at the first game, it's called Arms Cross. It's a very simple game. It's actually a mass game. So it's a game that could be played by a university instructor in a big hall, or by a teacher with a smaller classroom, or someone giving a workshop somewhere. But the misconception there, the first misconception out of the 6 that are offered is about habitual behavior. And so it really talks about the habits of society and how the habits that we've developed, which used to serve us, no longer serve us, and how hard it is now to change habits that have become damaging, whether it's just jumping in your car and driving to get, 1 bottle of milk, or something that, just being a little bit addicted to a petroleum economy, et cetera, et cetera. But you can frame it any way you like, but that's just a misconception that is being addressed by that particular game. And there are 6 of them. They include inappropriate frames or uncertainty, autonomous behavior, long delays, the fact that there are very long delays and the information you get might be received long after you actually need it for decision-making purposes, and magnification about small changes that can have big impacts. These are some of the misconceptions that are treated by the games in the climate change playbook, and those are found throughout the discussion about climate change. I wanted to just say maybe something about the function, because that also can be useful for educators. And we have these 3 different kinds of games in the book. And one, as I mentioned, is a mass game that can be played by a large number of people. And we've played them in big auditoriums, in conferences, et cetera. And it works because people don't need to interact. And so there are a number of games that fit into that category. The second is a demonstration game. And so a game that fits into this framework is that a small group of people can demonstrate a game dynamic or play the game, and other people can watch it and they can still benefit from observing the game. So again, this works when you have a small group. You can put them up on a stage or have them stand in front of your classroom. They can play the game, and the other people, the other students, can watch and still benefit from it. And the last is a participation game. And when you have around 30 or less people, then these games are ones where everyone plays, and the dynamic is important, that everybody participates. So this games matrix not only helps educators pick based on some of the parameters that they have, but also based on some misconceptions that we've identified within the climate change within the climate change area, that if a teacher is trying to emphasize something, they can use that to select the game. So Linda, what would you add to that?
I think that was just really clear, but I do have a couple of things I could add. When you asked earlier about systems thinking, we talked, one of the features of systems thinking that I mentioned was this idea of interdependence. There's many other features of systems, and one of those features is feedback. And that's not like "you look nice today" kind of feedback. This is feedback loops, closed loops of cause and effect. And another has to do with accumulations, CO2 accumulating in the atmosphere. We like to, Jillian and I and other systems folks often use a metaphor, a physical analog, you could call it, called a bathtub, to explain that. But I think if I think about, what I understand many educators are trying to, what are the basic moves that you want young people to walk through with climate education? You want them to understand the essential principles of climate systems. You want them to know how to assess scientifically credible information. Does this make sense? If we say the policy is to turn down emissions, is that is that accurate? We want to communicate about climate and climate change in a meaningful way. So they have metaphors, they have, Jillian mentioned narratives, they have even games can be a useful way for young people to communicate. And can they make informed decisions and responsible decisions related to climate? Can they, if they want to take action, do they know the kind of action to take? So I think that the games are actually kind of meet those criteria. They definitely hit on some of what I think Jillian said about misconceptions. So, often, let's say with a feedback loop, we might think that, and I'm sure many people on this call are familiar, but there's, at least 5 different feedback loops that are occurring within in climate science. And I just want to shout out a great reference for this. There's a website called feedbackloopsclimate.com, has 5 beautiful videos, very short, on 5 different feedback loops that are occurring. One is around forests, permafrost, atmosphere, albedos, the albedo loop, and oceans. And I'll just give you a very quick example of one that has to do with, let's say, permafrost. As temperatures rise, permafrost bogs thaw. As they thaw, the bogs release methane. As they release methane, which is, I think, 25% more powerful than carbon CO2, then temperatures rise. So if you see that just reinforcing on itself, that's, for anybody who might not be familiar, that's a feedback loop. And the climate change playbook addresses as you engage with feedback loop. There's a great one in there called, Jillian, it's a feedback loop game. I'm just having a moment here.
Living loops.
Living loops. Thank you. Living loops is fantastic to physically embody feedback loops. You actually are in a loop yourself, either as a reinforcing or balancing loop. But I don't know, Stina, if you want me to talk about the bathtub, I could, or.
Yeah, that would be, especially like it would be great. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Just a very quick, I'll try to, so the bathtub metaphor originated when with a professor who's still very active at MIT, John Sturman. I was working with him as a doctoral student. There are several papers written that we co-authored about the bathtub, but it's basically the idea that just think of the atmosphere as like a bathtub. The faucet is the amount of global warming pollution, CO2, going into the atmosphere. That's the rate of emissions. The tub is the accumulation of CO2 in the atmosphere, and the drain are carbon sinks, carbon drawdown. And for many years, prior to probably in the Industrial Revolution, our CO2, our carbon cycle was operating pretty well. It was a dynamic equilibrium. We then started to put too much CO2 in the atmosphere, and it had to accumulate it. And so the bathtub's a great way to show young people and adults that if you have twice as much CO2 going into the atmosphere as is going out, which is happening right now, if you just ask that simple question, we could actually do this super quick in the chat. If you have twice as much going in as going out, what do you think will happen to the amount in the tub? And if people want to it's always good to put a stake in the ground to say, what do you think? And I think people anyone who's taken a bath knows. I'm going to wait, Sarah Jane. I see you just put it in the chat.
Linda, repeat the question, and I'll type the question.
Okay, sure. I'll repeat the question. Just think of a tub. If you put twice as much water into a tub as is flowing out through the drain, what happens to the level of water in the tub? If you put twice as much CO2 into the atmosphere as is flowing out through carbon sinks, what happens to the level in the atmosphere? Great, thank you, Kelly. Maria, excellent. So that's a fundamental principle that, believe it or not, can be a little hard to get, but you can get it much more easily when you use the bathtub. And that means that you can be discerning. Do you remember we talked about the 4 levels of climate understanding that teachers are looking for, which is making informed decisions, but knowing how to assess scientific information. This actually happened, and I'm not going to say like the details, but if a leader says, I'm committed to reducing the amount of emissions by 14%, well, if you know that doing that only turns down the faucet, it doesn't actually turn it down enough. If there's still more going into the tub is going out, then you know that that reduction is really just turning down the faucet. It's not reducing it enough that the level in the tub is going to go down. So I won't, you can learn a lot more about this. We have expanded broadly a lot of options around thinking like a bathtub. So in our climate change playbook, there's a great experiential game that a whole class can play. You take, tape on the floor, you create a bathtub, the kids walk in and out of the tub, and they have to predict what's going to happen. There's all the instructions are all there. We also have, I created with a producer named Eric Handler, a video that young kids narrated, and we created that for COP26. That's available on YouTube. That's just 3 minutes long, but it really gives you the kind of basics of thinking like a bathtub and the call to action, like why do we want to do that? We also have an app now that's free, and it's on the App Store, that is an augmented reality app. So you can project your bathtub, if you're in Philadelphia, on the Liberty Bell, or you could project it in your classroom, or you could in front of your library, and the kids can use it as a teaching tool for each other, but also with adults. And that's one of the, I think, could be a very meaningful engagement for kids. You can assess their understanding by them teaching others. And so we would love for educators to, get the app and try it out, try it in their classroom, see how, I think I would say, upper elementary and up. I recently did a demo of it in front of during a town sustainability day, and I had 10-year-olds. 10-year-olds got it. I was amazed. So.
And I think it would be I know some folks are asking what the name of the app is, so maybe we could post that at all.
And I shared a link for it with Sarah SJ, so everybody can get that. Yeah. And I'll also say that I'll share this with everyone at the end. We've been putting together a Pinterest page just because it's nicely visual. All the resources, like all the research articles, related videos, others who are doing work related to this bathtub metaphor. So that's all on this Pinterest page, and so everybody can get that as well.
Yeah.
And I'll just say lastly, the last thing I'm doing is right now I'm working with a school district, and we're creating an enrichment unit around the bathtub that will be used for this whole school. And what we're hoping is that that we'll kind of get a think like a bathtub. Let's just say it's Philadelphia, but think like a bathtub Philadelphia, and the kids will create their own. You'll be able to see their bathtub projected on their own environment, and they can create little like shorts about why it's important and use it as a kind of advocacy piece.
That's amazing. Yeah, I think that's a great example of an experiential learning activity that you have designed, and that concept specifically that it targets, which is great. Yeah, I guess before we move on really quickly to maybe opening up some questions, I guess, how do you see educators thinking about the integration of live in-person experiences with technologies, or incorporating sort of these activities and reflections that maximize that student learning? I would just be curious to kind of hear from you all. I don't know if Mary, maybe you have some thoughts from
Yeah, sure. I'll say some ideas around using citizen science and using technology to do citizen science, which is an experiential learning activity. So there are a lot of amazing apps that help you do citizen science. And I'll just share a couple of my favorites that are relevant to learning about climate change as well. One is called Inaturalist, which is free and available for iOS and Android. And Inaturalist is essentially an online community and a technology to help record and identify living things, so plants and animals and fungi, etc. And what you do is you can take your app out and take a picture or a recording of a sound and upload it to the app or to the website. And then there's artificial intelligence that will help identify what it is that you've seen, but also other members of the community can go on and help identify what you've seen. And there's a version of that that's designed specifically for children that's gamified and has privacy protections built in, and that is called Seek, S-E-E-K. Uses the same database. It uses this amazing computer vision to help identify what you've seen. That's really relevant for climate change studies because it allows you to see shifts in ranges of species over time. Like you can see that the range of the Baltimore Oriole is changing and they may not be seen in Baltimore if the climate keeps changing. So one thing I love about citizen science is that it provides a way to use technology that kids love, is really engaging, but it's actually really additive. It doesn't distract from being out in nature. And I'll just add, there's multiple programs like that. I'll mention very quickly, there's Project Budburst and Nature's Notebook are focused on looking at changes in when trees flower and fruit, for instance, in response to climate change. And all of these are free, so I encourage you to check them out. And they're really enhanced by doing some pre-work to understand why you're using these technologies and some post-work to analyze the data that you've collected. But then there's this great experiential education activity in the middle, which is going outside and collecting data.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I guess what predictions do you have about how technology will be used to support innovative new educational experiences in the future? Thinking ahead. Doesn't have to be Mary necessarily, but I'm just curious for the group.
Well, Jillian, you okay if I'll hop in?
Of course.
I think that mixed reality, augmented reality, virtual reality really could have a wonderful place for particularly something that what I focus on, which is systems literacy. The reason is, if you think about it, we don't see systems walking around. There's no line between the wolf and the elk and the beaver in Yellowstone, and yet they are, and the aspen trees and the trout, they're all interrelated, right? As we know from much research around what's happened in Yellowstone. But one of the beauties of technology is that it can augment our reality so that we can see systems in a whole different way. Right now, I've been a practitioner and a researcher for over 25 years. And, we've gone from pencil and paper to, computer simulations, but it's a whole different story when you're engaged in the system and you can see the connections and manipulate them, which is what I think these technologies allow us to do. It really hits home, interactive, experiential, so many pluses from a learning perspective. So I was really not a person who thought they would ever be a huge advocate, honestly, a long time ago, of wearing the goggles and the virtual reality, but I actually see a role for it, both the goggles, but also just even augmented reality has so much potential. And I think when people see this app, they can see just how easy it is to, if you have a tablet, just to incorporate that kind of learning into a current curriculum. It seems to me pretty seamless.
I might just add one or two sentences. There's a lot coming. I've been a part of a number of discussions in the conservation community exploring how to use augmented reality. The headsets are really interesting, and there's certainly a lot of activity there, but even just using some of the basic mechanics that have come out with games like Pokemon Go. There's a lot of activity in that space now when it comes to just helping people learn about species, about threatened species, about behavior, etc. And that's just, it's all happening right now, and it's coming our way. Some of these things are already out there, but I think we'll see a big jump in that in the next year or two.
Yes,
I agree.
I agree. So SJ, I don't know if you want to open it up for QA now.
Yes, let's do that. Hi, everyone. Can you hear me? Fantastic. All right, this is the time for our Q&A. So we have a couple questions that are coming in. We'll allow some of this time for audience Q&A, and then if we don't have questions, we have some more questions prepared so we can go back to those. We want to make sure our panelists get all the time to share these incredible resources. And we are, I'll remind you, compiling a list of all the resources because I'm trying to capture them as quickly as they're saying them to include in the follow-up email. The first question we have is one, and I think this is probably on the minds of a lot of folks, and I hope our panelists will have an answer because it's a tricky one, but we'll see. So this is from Caruana. Apologies if I am pronouncing that incorrectly. And she asks, how do you get around students not willing to believe because their parents do not? I was listening to a talk show and the parents admitted that they did not believe, but they tell their children to just regurgitate, I think, what the teacher says so they can get a good grade. I think I listened to that same talk show, Caruana, or maybe it's a broad topic of conversation. So thank you for asking that. Do any
I
of
think
our
this speaks
thoughts?
a lot. Sorry.
Go ahead, Jillian.
This speaks a lot to the topic of this panel. So the opportunity that experiential learning provides is really a different way for the student to experience some of these topics, dynamics versus a lecture. So if the parents are somehow saying, regurgitate that, to get your grade, it's a lot less easy to regurgitate when you're just playing a game. You're having a physical experience. Often these games, and there are different ways of playing games. For example, there are two modes. There's discovery mode and confirmation mode. And in discovery mode, people don't know how to win that game. So you're just really drawing on your kind of natural behaviors in order to play. And in that way, people can experience something that's a little bit potentially disconnected from what's going on in reality. The debriefing connects the dynamics of the game with things that are going on in the real world. And it helps people say, well, this is the dynamics in the game. Do we see these dynamics in the real world? And so it's more of a question inquiry approach. And that might just separate it a little bit from the more traditional kind of taught or lecture-based approaches and get maybe a little bit of a more authentic experience, and then let the students decide for themselves.
I love that answer. Any other panelists have thoughts on that particular question?
I have a thought, but Mary has got to have so much to say about this. So I just want to give you first dibs, Mary.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I'll just say that, I think that's part of what I love about citizen science and about experiential education in general, is that we're not asking students to believe us, but rather to experience climate change themselves. So we're not asking them to choose between believing their parents or believing their teacher, but something like a project that allows them to see that animals that used to be here are no longer here because they've shifted in response to temperature. That's just data that you're experiencing, and you're experiencing actually collecting and looking at real data. It's not, you're not being asked to believe something else that someone has put in front of you. So just being part of the actual process, I think it shifts it away from being a matter of belief at all.
Yeah, I think what the approach that we're talking about allows a young person to do, and I've heard this same exact thing. I actually polled a middle school teacher yesterday in my town. I said, what are some of the struggles that kids are experiencing? And she said, the one thing is that their parents are telling them one thing, the school is telling them another, and they're told to make nice and just, listen to the teacher, but, don't necessarily believe it. This is, not all kids, but some. And I think it's a perfect opportunity to say, let's understand the mental models of our parents. Okay, so it's cold outside, so there's no global warming. Let's just say that's kind of a one that I've heard. Okay, well, let's look at that one, and let's look at the science behind that. And then, so that I think so, meeting it head on, not trying to necessarily change the parents' mindset, but helping the kids know that they can actually understand that perspective and put that perspective on the table and look at it. That I think that's really important. And the other is what I'm really excited about. I think, especially just because I'm working on this bathtub, but you can do this in a lot of other ways. And I think citizen science is probably really prime for this, is having the young persons use technology or use the data that they've collected from citizen science as a way to be the expert themselves, as a way to advocate, as a way to inform others. I think we need to give our 10, 12, 15-year-olds, it's their future, right? They want to understand, we have to put them in the position of teaching others, informing others, asking questions, understanding mental models that are different than ours. That's part of the skill set, I think, that also needs to develop, not just taking in information about climate science, but meeting those different perspectives. What are the skills that we need to do that?
These are such fantastic ideas. You exceeded my expectations for answers to those questions. So thank you so much. I wanted to ask a quick follow-up question to Mary. I can't imagine why a teacher would be asking this, but we had someone ask about the quality control features on citizen science and asking, if students enter info into an app, what's to prevent them from submitting, fake data, things that, maybe a 15-year-old might find funny or silly, but that is not helpful to the scientists. Again, I can't imagine why any teacher would imagine that a student would do that, but do you have any
we see it all the time
on that?
Right. So, right. In fact, there are a lot of teenagers will submit a photo of one of their friends and label it orangutan or something like that. So, right. So this is a great point. I'm really glad, specifically for iNaturalist, I'm glad you brought it up. So it's really important, if you are using it as an educator, to monitor your students. And it is a teachable moment to talk about why it's important that you're not muddying the data. But it has to be really active. You can't just have the students use the app without monitoring how they use it. And one thing that we do really like to emphasize for teachers is that you don't want to incentivize kids to enter as much data as possible, because which is easy to do. Say oh, we'll give you an A if you enter 20 observations or 100 observations. That is the wrong kind of incentive, because that incentivizes them to take pictures of each other or just of things like pets that don't actually add to scientific understanding. So we want to emphasize quality observations and not quantity. So say if you enter 3 observations that other people can help identify, then you can get extra credit, or just that you do 2 that have all the data that you need, 2 observations that have all the data you need, including location and date and time. So that's important with iNaturalist specifically. In general, though, I mean, quality control is an important aspect of citizen science. One thing that works really well with citizen science is that the volume of data means that you can use statistical analysis to deal with any anomalies that have showed up. So don't worry too much about it. And then also lots of projects have careful protocols built in, which is just a great way to teach different aspects of the scientific process, is teaching the protocol.
Thank you. I think that made me feel very assured. So I hope it did for our teachers as well. I wanted to ask a question that's been coming up from a few different folks in a few different ways, which I think gets to some of this idea of, misconceptions, or maybe dealing with parents who have heard certain things or have certain ideas. The question about teasing apart kind of natural changes in climate and systems and processes from human-induced changes. Are there specific games or concepts that you can recommend to help students make sense of those differences, as they build their understanding and maybe communicate about those differences as well? Jillian or Linda, maybe you want to tackle that one?
I think that's a really great question. It's not what we organize the climate change playbook around. So I have to think about it, but I would love to know what other ideas that come up.
Yeah, this might be one when we go to the educator breakout groups, if folks have ideas about how they've tackled that question in their classrooms, that would be a great one to share. Appreciate it.
Yeah, I'll just say quickly that, of course, I've encountered this challenge too. And I think that it does point to the importance of context and understanding, making sure that kids have access to, like, for instance, if they're collecting citizen science data that helps them understand climate change, comparing those to data that were collected at other times, or ice core data, that kind of thing, that give you a sense of how things have changed and how those changes differ from patterns in the past. So the importance of sort of a broad scope of background information that you can compare to what kids are experiencing now.
Okay, we are getting to the end, so just time for a couple last questions. I have one. I think I'll direct this question toward Linda, because it's about sort of gamification in higher ed, and someone is asking if you're seeing that being used, for example, in the teaching of subjects like agriculture, maybe at an agricultural and mining institution, or those types of, kind of more technical education schools. Are you seeing those types of institutions use VR gamification in those higher education courses, or what are we kind of seeing today, in higher ed, and maybe if you have some examples in K-12 as well?
Yeah, I'll just speak to it briefly, but I know Jillian also has some experience with gaming and sustainability. So, so one of the as we mentioned way earlier, I co-founded something called Toggle Lab, which is this metaverse education studio, and the co-founding is with School Fab Lab, and School Fab Lab creates really interesting maker spaces that are completely virtual. And so if you want to learn how to create, anything using a 3D printer or a laser cutter or anything like that, you can go into this virtual space, go through all the steps, and then when you get into a real makerspace, and by the way, if anybody's not familiar with makerspaces, they are proliferating like crazy right now. They're in libraries, they're in community centers, they're in university settings, and now in middle schools. It's really fabulous. If you come up with the idea, you can make it happen. So anyway, I would say that's one. It's not for some of the examples you talked about, but it is using virtual reality for something that would have been, you would have had to do it in person. And so you can, Labsters is creating a lot of this kind of experience, I know. But so if you want to dissect a frog, you can do that in a virtual experience. If you want to understand how the heart works, you can put the heart on the table, quote, in augmented reality in front of you and understand the different chambers. So there's lots and lots of emerging applications. If you if you want to understand how to tell a better speech, you can go and put your goggles on and have, speech coaching. I've just noticed that one. So it's really endless possibilities.
It might be interesting to look into industry applications. I don't know specifically about conventional agricultural courses, but I have seen some really innovative courses in vocational schools, even in a project that I worked on with UNIDO. It was in Ethiopia, Zambia, Iraq, and they were helping vocational schools use augmented reality, and the partners were from industry. So they were helping them. This one was looking specifically at reconstruction and at heavy industry and things like that. But I know that Industry 4.0 is what the next generation of industry capacity development of staff and students is really all about. And in that space, you might find some applications for agriculture, because I've certainly seen them in other places, even all over the world.
All right, this has been such a fruitful discussion. I feel like we maybe should have allocated 2 hours for this. We might have to bring some of these panelists back in the future, because I think we could have such rich discussion. And some of our panelists will be sticking around to join the educator breakout conversations in about a half hour from now at the end of our session. So if you're able to stick around, you will have the chance to ask them some questions directly. We would love that. But thank you again. Before we break, we're going to go next into a 2-minute break, and then we'll come back. Before we do that, I wanted to give one last opportunity for our panelists. If you have any parting words or want to just mention any other ways that folks can stay in touch with your work, we'd love that. And of course, as we mentioned, we'll also include some follow-up links in the emails to connect you with many of the resources shared today. So maybe start with Jillian.
Sure. I have a blog on my website which has a game. It has a search, but it also has a game tag. And I've written over the years about tips for game administrators, how to turn boring topics into games, 14 steps for that. And there's a lot of content there about using games in learning. So I would suggest that people might want to check out the blog on the brightgreenlearning.com website.
Excellent, thank you. Linda?
I also have a few too many websites, but lindabuswini.com is the children's, and there's free teachers guides on that, which I think people might find valuable. lindabuswini.net is all things systems, and then the togglelab.com is the metaverse education studio work. You'll find the video, the bathtub video and the app are more related to the Toggle Lab, but we've also, I think, shared that. I'd love people to stay in touch. I'm so have such respect for the educators who are meeting this issue and this need head on, and want to do everything I can to support your work.
I'll just share that I put a couple of links in the chat as well, and we can send them out. So the program where I work now is Roots and Shoots, rootsandshoots.org, and there are a lot of relevant resources there, all free. And then also I worked for a long time at National Geographic, and there's a ton of free resources there as well at natgeoed.org. And there we have a lot of resources to support the use of citizen science in the classroom. And I'll put one more link in the chat as well to the Citizen Science Association, because that's a great jumping off point, including they have an education working group. It's a really great professional learning community of folks using citizen science as a teaching and learning tool.
Sarah Jane, can I just say one last thing real quick?
Absolutely.
We haven't had a chance to mention the third author, just I guess author, is a really one of the long-standing system dynamics experts in the field, Dennis Meadows. So just thank you to Dennis for all of his contributions to this work.
And he is quite prolific on YouTube. So watching some of his YouTube lectures, he also plays a lot of games in his lectures, even on YouTube. So you could actually see some of the games from the Climate Change Playbook if you look up Dennis and watch his YouTube
Dennis
video.
Meadows. Yep.
Right.
Great.
Amazing. Thank you for mentioning that. We will include some of those links. We'll also include a link to where anyone can purchase the Climate Change Playbook. Of course, you can find it on Amazon. You can also find it directly at the publisher, Chelsea Green Publisher. And some of our lucky guests have already won a copy if they registered early for the webinar. You'll be getting emails tomorrow indicating whether you have won, and then we'll also have some opportunities to win a few more in our final educator breakout. So one more reason to stick around if you can, and it's not like 10 p.m. as it is for our friends over in Europe. So thank you again. Yeah, I think we're heading a little over time now. So we will take a quick break and then come back for our product session. A huge thanks to Stina and our panelists. I'm going to turn it back over to Pete quickly for the break, and we'll throw up a poll question, and then we'll get back together pretty soon for product.
Thank you so much. And another huge thank you to Stina, Linda, Mary, and Jillian. Fantastic conversation to be a part of. We really appreciate you taking the time to share all of that with us. You probably just saw an experiential learning poll pop up. Highly encourage everyone to participate in this, but also in the next 2 minutes, take a moment, grab some water, quick bio break. I'll be back with you in just a couple more minutes before we start our second session. See y'all soon.